red dirt scrub with a sentimental owner. This isn't a ranch. It's a museum to someone's grandfather. Gerald Pruitt held Hank Dutton's deed up between two fingers like something he'd found on the sidewalk, half turned to his two attorneys, laughing the comfortable laugh of a man who has conducted enough foreclosures to stop thinking of them as events in other people's lives. The conference room air smelled of recycled refrigeration and new carpet, a long institutional remove from the baked red clay outside where 280 head of Hank's cattle had been grazing the same section for 41 years. Hank Dutton was 74 years old. Calloused hands. A belt buckle from the 1989 Comanche County Rodeo. He was sitting across from a man in a blazer who had never walked a fence line at 5 a.m. and who had, Gerald's attorneys would later establish, never read the fourth page of the deed he was holding up between two fingers. Gerald set the deed down and slid it back across the table like a returned verdict. Foreclosure's already filed, Hank. You've had 2 years to find a way out. You didn't. This is over. Diane Tull, seated to Hank's left with a closed folder in her hands, said nothing. She waited. But what Gerald Pruitt didn't know, what his two attorneys hadn't checked, what the title company hadn't flagged, was that on page 4 of a 1981 deed amendment, Hank's father had reserved the mineral rights to that 640 acres for the Dutton family forever, and a petroleum geologist had just valued those rights at $1.3 million. The bank cannot foreclose on what it does not own. Do you know that feeling when someone tells you everything you built is already gone, and somewhere in your coat there's a paper that proves they're wrong? Let's go back 41 years, to the morning Hank Dutton's father added one paragraph to a deed and never explained why. 1980, Comanche County, Oklahoma. Elias Dutton is 62 years old and has survived the first wave of the farm credit crisis with his ranch intact. Barely. He has renegotiated one operating loan and paid off a second equipment line and sold 8 sections of his original claim to a neighboring operator, which hurt him the way selling land always hurts a man who believes the land is not exactly his to sell, justice to steward for whoever comes after. He makes an appointment with a lawyer in Lawton. He drives the 40 minutes in a truck that needs new brake pads. He sits in the lawyer's office for 3 hours. The lawyer is a man named Raymond Foss, who handles ag land matters, and who has, that year, seen enough farm credit crises to be genuinely worried about what the decade is going to produce in Comanche County. Raymond recommends the mineral rights reservation. He explains it in plain terms. The bank can take the surface if the loan defaults, but it cannot take what's explicitly reserved. If you separate the mineral rights from the surface conveyance in a properly recorded amendment, the mineral rights belong to the family in perpetuity, outside the reach of any surface creditor. Elias thinks about this. He asks, "What's under the land, Raymond?" Raymond says, "I don't know. Could be nothing. But it's Comanche County, and it's south of Wichita Falls. Could be something." Elias says, "Do it." Raymond drafts the amendment. Elias signs it, Elias Dutton, in his deliberate hand with the date. The amendment is filed with the county clerk and attached to the deed jacket. Elias drives home in the truck with the bad brakes and tells Hank about the meeting in the most general terms. A legal thing, Raymond recommended, protects the family from the banks during the credit contraction, without explaining what mineral rights means or why Raymond thought it mattered. Hank is 33. He is focused on the cattle and the operating loan and the spring calving schedule. He nods. He trusts his father's judgment on legal matters the way he trusts Raymond Foss on legal matters. completely, without needing to understand the specifics. The amendment is filed. Life continues. 41 years pass. Hank runs cattle. He survives 2 droughts, the 88 summer, the 96 midsummer that took 30 pounds off every animal in his pasture, and a catastrophic hail year in 2009 that destroyed his equipment barn and cost him $140,000 in machinery and infrastructure. He buries his wife Margaret in 2015 after 37 years of a marriage that was, by every measure, Hank knew how to apply exactly right. He stands at the gravesite in the November wind and says the things you say and drives back to the ranch and checks on the cattle because that is what you do. In 2019, after a disease outbreak takes 60 head and forces a complete herd restructuring, Hank takes out the largest operating loan of his farming life. He has done this before. He has always paid his way back. He believes he will pay his way back again. The drought of 2020 and 2021 does what everything else couldn't. 2 consecutive bad years on an operation that was already leveraged. The cash position hollows out. The loan payments slip. Gerald Pruitt, who has been bank president in Lawton for 6 years and who has never particularly liked the look of the Dutton land, too remote, too single commodity, too reliant on one man's physical presence to hold together, begins the foreclosure process in the spring of 2021. Gerald is the kind of banker who is efficient in a way that is not unkind, but is not kind either. He has processed agricultural foreclosures in Comanche County before. He finds the sentiment of old ranchers tiresome without actively wishing them harm. He is, in the way of institutional authority, simply doing his job. His job, this time, contained an error he hadn't noticed. At a Comanche County Farm Bureau luncheon in March 2021, Gerald was the guest speaker on the topic of rural credit health. He said, with Hank present at a table of 6, that the ag crisis was exposing operators who should have diversified out of single commodity cattle 15 years ago. He did not name Hank. He didn't need to. 3 people at Hank's table glanced toward him. Hank ate his lunch. He was not the kind of man who reacted to being named obliquely in a banker's speech. He was the kind of man who finished his lunch and drove home and walked the fence line in the late afternoon heat. A younger rancher named Carl Briggs found Hank in the parking lot afterward. Carl said, quietly, that he'd heard Pruitt's people telling folks at the bank that the Dutton land wouldn't sell for what was owed. Hank said thank you. He called a land attorney in Lawton. The attorney told him the assessment was probably right. The land market was soft. He saw no clear way out. He drove home. He walked the fence line in the afternoon. He put his hand on a cedar post, one of the original posts Elias had put in, and stood there for a while. What happened next, nobody at that luncheon saw coming. In April, Gerald sent the formal acceleration letter by certified mail. Outstanding balance, $340,000. 30-day cure period. Foreclosure proceeding date, June 15th. The letter was written in clean legal language and left no ambiguity. Hank read it at the kitchen table with Elias's brand registry open beside the loan documents, not for any strategic reason, just because he found the old notebook grounding. The brand registry smelled of the 1950s, and the letter smelled of toner, and together they were, in some way Hank couldn't have named, the whole story of the ranch in 2 documents. He put the letter in a manila folder. 3 weeks later, not because he knew Diane Tull had found anything, but because he'd seen her survey truck on the county road near his fence line and remembered, distantly, that a surveyor had helped his father with a boundary question in 1981, he called the county surveyor's office. He was told the current county surveyor was Diane Tull, 44, and he left his number. Diane called back that afternoon. She had found the amendment 4 months earlier. She was in the middle of a state digitization project, indexing historical deed records for the county's digital archive, and she had pulled the Dutton parcel jacket as part of a routine sequence. Inside the jacket, behind the 1939 original deed and a 1952 boundary amendment, was a 4-page document filed in 1981. Page 4 of that document was a mineral rights reservation clause, signed in blue ink by Elias Dutton. Diane read line 4 of the amendment. Mineral rights appurtenant to the above described real property are hereby reserved to the grantor's heirs and assigns in perpetuity and are expressly excluded from any surface conveyance. She sat at the records counter in the fluorescent light and read it again. She had no obligation to contact Hank Dutton. The document was public record. It was indexed correctly under the original parcel number. The fact that Gerald's bank had pulled title on adjacent parcels and on the surface rights without pulling the full Dutton parcel jacket was not Diane's legal problem. She called anyway. She drove to the ranch. She told Hank what she'd found. It took 3 conversations for the full magnitude to register. Hank was not a man who read legal documents carefully. That was his soft spot. Always had been, and the concept of mineral rights reservation was not something he thought about on a daily basis. On the first visit, he understood that there was a clause. On the second visit, he understood that the clause meant something specific about what the bank could and could not take. On the third visit, when Diane brought a copy of a confidential petroleum geologist's assessment she had tracked down through the Tulsa Energy Company, whose land acquisition department had been quietly surveying Comanche County's subsurface formations, he understood the number. $1.3 million. His land sat over one of the target formations in the geologist's 2020 survey. Not the whole ranch. The surface was surface, and the bank could pursue the surface. But the mineral rights, the rights his father had separated from the surface in that Lawton office in 1980, on Raymond Foss's recommendation, in a 3-hour meeting Elias had mentioned to Hank in the most general possible terms, were worth more than twice what the bank was owed. And the bank couldn't touch them. Hank sat with that for a while. He walked the fence line that evening in the early dark after Diane had gone and put his hand on the cedar post again and thought about his father driving home from Lawton in the truck with the bad brakes. Elias had not known what was under the land. He had only known that Raymond Foss thought it was worth protecting. My father always said the land feeds you twice, Elias had told Raymond in that office. Hank didn't know this. Elias had never repeated it. But it was true. The land was feeding the family twice, once from the cattle, and once from whatever was below the surface that Elias had reserved without knowing what it was. In June, 2 weeks before the conference, Gerald called Hank directly with what he framed as a courtesy conversation. He suggested Hank consider a deed in lieu of foreclosure, voluntary transfer, no lawsuit, no public auction. I'm trying to save you the embarrassment of a courthouse auction, Hank, at your age, for your family's sake. His tone was the tone of a man performing a large favor for a smaller one. Hank said he'd need to speak with his attorney. Gerald said, of course. Of course. Hank hung up and called Diane Tull. She had, in those same weeks, been in conversation with the Tulsa Energy Company's land acquisition department. They knew about the reservation clause. They'd found it in their own survey of the county's mineral rights profile, which is why their geologist had included the Dutton acreage in the confidential assessment. They wanted the mineral rights. They wanted them enough that the $1.3 million number in the assessment was not the ceiling, it was the floor. The deed in lieu of foreclosure Gerald was offering would transfer everything, surface and mineral rights, together to the bank, because the bank had no idea the mineral rights were reserved and could not know unless someone checked page 4 of the 1981 amendment, which no one in Gerald's office had done. Hank said no. Politely, he thanked Gerald for calling and said he'd see him on the 15th. On June 10th, 5 days before the conference, Diane filed a certified copy of the 1981 deed amendment with the county clerk, formally re-indexing it under the current parcel identifier, which had only been indexed under the 1939 original. Gerald's bank had searched the 1939 index and stopped. The amendment was 3 pages deeper in the deed jacket. The title company had done the same search. Neither had gone deep enough. Now the amendment was indexed at the top. Now it would appear in any competent title search. Now it was impossible to miss. Hank's attorney got the call from Diane on June 11th at 6:15 in the evening. The call lasted 41 minutes. When it was over, Hank walked out to the fence line in the early dark and stood with his hand on a cedar post for a while. He was not thinking about Gerald Pruitt. He was thinking about Elias in the Lawton office with Raymond Foss, signing a page that would sit in a deed jacket for 41 years without being read. And about the way the land feeds you twice if you let it. The conference room on June 15th was what a bank conference room always is: fluorescent lights, long table, chairs that announce their institutional seriousness by being mildly uncomfortable. Gerald's 2 attorneys were to his right. The title company representative was at the end. 2 junior officers were along the wall. Gerald made his opening statement. The acceleration was valid. The cure period had lapsed. The bank intended to proceed with foreclosure on the Dutton Surface Estate in Comanche County. He was mid-sentence when Diane Tull opened her folder. She placed the certified copy of the 1981 deed amendment on the table in front of Gerald. Face up. She turned it so he could read it from where he was sitting. She placed her index finger on line 4. "Before you proceed," she said, "I'd like you to read this." Gerald picked up the document. He read line 4. "Mineral rights appurtenant to the above described real property are hereby reserved to the grantor's heirs and assigns in perpetuity, and are expressly excluded from any surface conveyance." One of Gerald's attorneys went very still. The title company representative, who understood, better than anyone else in the room, what a missed mineral rights reservation in a deed jacket meant for his company's liability, stood up from his chair without deciding to. Gerald read line 4 again. Out loud. Slower the second time, the way you read something you understand the words of, but cannot quite believe the order of. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside the conference room window, the red clay was baking in 98-degree heat. The same red clay Gerald had called scrub in front of 2 attorneys and a title company representative 20 minutes ago. It looked different now. Not to the eye. It was the same dry, baked surface it had always been. But in the room, in the arithmetic, it was different, because below it was something the bank did not own and could never own. Gerald set the document down. He looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the title company representative. The title company representative was still standing, which nobody had asked him to do, and which he seemed to realize all at once. He sat back down with the careful movement of a man trying to make an action look intentional. When Gerald spoke again, his voice had lost the register it had carried into the room. "We'll need to recess. The foreclosure on the Surface Estate was not stopped. the bank's claim on the surface was valid, and the proceeding continued in its legal form. But a surface estate with mineral rights reserved and documented and indexed is not the same asset as a surface estate with mineral rights included. The bank's appraisal had been based on the latter. Gerald's attorneys spent 3 days reviewing the amendment and its implications. Their conclusion was the same as Diane's. The mineral rights were separated, valid, and belonged to the Dutton family. The Tulsa Energy Company made an offer for the mineral rights within 2 weeks. A license, not a sale, 10-year term, exclusive drilling access, annual royalty structure estimated at $180,000 per year. Hank used the first year's advance from the licensing agreement to negotiate a restructured operating loan with a credit union in Lawton, at terms Gerald's bank could not match, because Gerald's bank was now entangled in a title insurance claim against the title company that would occupy their legal department for the better part of a year. Hank paid down the original balance with a portion of the licensing advance. The rest he put into the herd, restocking at a measured pace, rebuilding the operation the same way Elias had rebuilt it after the credit crisis of the 80s. Diane Tull was named for a Records Preservation Award that fall by the Oklahoma County Surveyors Association for identifying the indexing gap in the Dutton parcel and bringing it to the attention of the property owner. She accepted it at a ceremony in Oklahoma City and said in 2 sentences that doing the job correctly sometimes means doing more than the job asks for. She drove back to Comanche County the same day. Gerald's bank filed the title insurance claim. Gerald's career at the bank did not end that summer. Institutional accountability moves at institutional speed. But the Dutton matter was not, in his attorney's later description, something the bank discussed in meetings. Hank sat at the kitchen table that fall with Elias's brand registry, open beside the signed loan restructuring agreement. The brand registry, a small leather notebook, the D-Bar brand registered in 1952, Elias's handwriting on the registration page. The loan agreement, typed, clean, the new terms on page 2. And on top of the manila folder, where the acceleration letter used to be, the certified copy of the 1981 amendment, line 4, underlined in pencil by Diane Tull. My father always said the land feeds you twice. He hadn't known the exact words until Raymond Foss's daughter, cleaning out her father's files after his death in 2019, found the notes from the 1980 meeting and sent them to Hank on a whim. Raymond had written down everything Elias said, including that line. Hank folded the note and put it in the front of Elias's brand registry. Then he went out to walk the fence line. The line was where it had always been. The cedar posts were old, and some of them needed replacing, a project for the spring. The cattle were in the south pasture, the same pasture where Elias had run his first herd in 1952, and where Hank had run his herd since 1980. The land was red clay and brown grass, and the smell of fence post and cattle dust, and the particular dry heat of southwestern Oklahoma in October. Below it, something Elias had never seen, but had protected anyway. The land feeds you twice, if you know how to let it. Maybe you've inherited something without fully understanding what it is. Maybe someone made a decision for you before you were old enough to ask why. Maybe the document is in a drawer somewhere, unread, doing its work in silence. These things accumulate. They wait. They surface, sometimes years later, sometimes through the hands of a stranger who finds your name in a county record and calls you on the phone. If Hank's story stayed with you, if you've ever been told everything you built is already gone, tell me in the comments. Tell me what happened next. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is in the middle of a bad season, looking at paperwork they don't know how to read. Like the video. Subscribe. The next story is a Wisconsin dairy barn, a 34-head Guernsey herd that a co-op buyer spent 3 years calling irrelevant, and a master cheese grader who walked in during the dismissal meeting with a signed designation that changed everything. The fence line itself had a history that was, in some ways, the ranch's history. Elias had strung the first wire in 1952, working from the survey stakes that the original homestead filing had established. He and a hired hand named Jimmy Burl had taken 3 weeks in June to run the perimeter, setting cedar posts from the timber he'd had hauled down from the Kiamichi Mountains. Good solid post cedar. Not the scrub variety that rotted in 10 years, but the dense mountain cedar that could hold wire for 40. Some of those posts were still standing. Not all of them. The southeast corner had been replaced after the 2009 hail year, and the north run along the county road had been updated twice since Hank took over. But the west line, on the far side from the road, still had Elias's original posts in sections. Hank had checked them every spring for 41 years, pressing his thumb against the wood below the bark to test for rot, replacing any that showed soft spots. He had replaced exactly 11 of the original cedar posts in 41 years. He knew which ones were original because he had kept a sketch in the back of the brand registry, a rough diagram of the fence perimeter, with notations for the post dates. Not the kind of thing you do intentionally for posterity. The kind of thing you do because you need to know which posts are which, and the information has to go somewhere. The brand registry was 71 years old. It smelled like leather and old paper and the particular combination of cattle dust and machine oil that characterized every structure on the Dutton place. Hank kept it in the kitchen, on the second shelf of the sideboard where Margaret had kept her good china, because it was the thing he wanted close to hand when he sat at the table in the morning. Margaret had never objected to the registry being on the china shelf. She had understood, with the practical grace of a woman who had married a rancher fully understanding what that meant, that a man who kept his family's brand history on the same shelf as his wife's good dishes was a man who believed those two things belonged in the same category. The things you were careful with. Hank missed her in specific ways. He missed her at the kitchen table in the morning when the coffee was ready and there was nobody to share it with. He missed her at the end of a long day, when the cattle were settled and the fence was checked and there was nowhere left to go except home. And home was just a house now, rather than a place where someone was waiting. He had walked the fence line alone for the first time the afternoon of her funeral, still in his good clothes, because he needed to do something with his hands and his feet, and the fence was always there. He had walked all 4 miles of the perimeter in a November wind and come back to the house and made coffee and sat with the brand registry and thought about everything and nothing. That was 2015. 6 years before Gerald's acceleration letter. The 6 years between had been the kind of ordinary that disguises itself as durability. The operation continued. The cattle cycled. The operating loans were managed until 2019 when the disease year hit, and then until the drought of 2020-21 when the math simply stopped working. Hank ran the numbers every quarter. He had always run the numbers every quarter. Margaret had taught him that, or more precisely, had insisted on it, sitting with him at the kitchen table every 3 months with the ledger open, working through the arithmetic until everything added up, or until they knew exactly what didn't. He kept running the numbers after she was gone. He ran them alone, but in the same format, at the same table. By spring of 2021, the numbers told him what Gerald's letter told him. The cash position was untenable. What the numbers didn't tell him, what no quarterly ledger exercise could have told him, was that below the surface of the 640 acres was a formation that a petroleum company's geologist had quietly assessed at $1.3 million, and that his father had reserved those rights in a 4-page document in 1981 that was sitting in the county clerk's deed jacket waiting for someone to read page 4. Diane Tull, read page 4. She was a county surveyor doing the quiet work of historical record-keeping, the work that most people think of as administrative and which is in fact the infrastructure on which everything else depends. She was indexing deed records for a state digitization project on a Tuesday afternoon in February, working through the Dutton parcel jacket as part of a routine sequence when she pulled the 1981 filing and read line 4 of the amendment. She sat at the records counter. The fluorescent lights hummed. The county clerk's office was empty in the late afternoon. She read the line again. Then she pulled the Tulsa Energy Company's publicly available surface survey filings for Comanche County. Not the confidential geological assessment, which she didn't have access to, but the public land survey footprint that indicated where they were looking. The Dutton parcel was inside the survey boundary. She called her supervisor to report the indexing error. Then she looked up Hank Dutton's phone number. She didn't reach him until the morning. She introduced herself. She said she had found something in the county records that she thought he should know about. She drove to the ranch that afternoon. She brought a copy of the amendment. She placed it on Hank's kitchen table, open to page 4, her finger on line 4. She read it aloud. She explained in simple terms what a mineral rights reservation meant in the context of a surface foreclosure proceeding. She said she was not an attorney and could not give him legal advice, but she thought he should show this to one immediately. Hank looked at the document for a long time. He looked at Elias's signature at the bottom of the page. Elias Dutton blue-inked the date. "My father never mentioned this," he said. "He probably thought of it as routine protection," Diane said. "It was standard practice during the credit crisis. Attorneys were recommending it across the county." Hank looked at the signature again. He thought about the truck with the bad brakes. He thought about Elias driving to Lawton and sitting in Raymond Foss's office for 3 hours and coming home and telling Hank it was a legal thing, a protection measure, without explaining what it meant. Elias had trusted Raymond Foss. Raymond had done his job. The document had sat in the jacket for 41 years, doing its invisible work, waiting for this exact moment. "Tell me what it means for the foreclosure," Hank said. Diane told him what she understood, which was that the bank could foreclose on the surface if the loan was in default, but could not claim what was explicitly separated from the surface by a recorded deed amendment. She said the interpretation would need to be verified by an attorney. Hank called an attorney that afternoon. The attorney confirmed it within 24 hours. Then they called the Tulsa Energy Company. The company's land acquisition department had known about the mineral rights reservation for 6 months. They had found it in their own county-wide mineral rights survey, which is why the Dutton acreage appeared in the confidential geological assessment. They wanted the rights. They had been waiting for the surface situation to clarify before approaching the owner. Now the owner was calling them. The negotiation was brief and straightforward, because the energy company understood the geology and the family understood what the land was and what it meant, and there was no gap between them on those points. 10-year exclusive drilling license, annual royalty payments estimated at $180,000 per year based on the formation assessment. First payment in advance, sufficient to address the bank balance. Hank called his credit union in Lawton about a restructured operating loan. The credit union, understanding the royalty stream, offered terms the bank could not match. Hank signed the restructuring agreement and used the energy company's advance to pay down the original balance to a level the new terms could service. Gerald's bank received formal notification that the mineral rights were separated and could not be recovered through the surface foreclosure. The title company, which had issued title insurance based on a search that missed the 1981 amendment, received a claim. The claim was substantial. Gerald's bank and the title company spent the following year working out the liability question. Hank was not party to that conversation. He was at the ranch, walking the fence line, checking the cattle, running the numbers at the kitchen table with the brand registry on the sideboard shelf. The numbers worked again. They would work for a long time. Diane Tull received her award in October. She said 2 sentences and drove home. She had not done what she did for an award. She had done it because it was there to be done, because the information existed, and it was hers to find, and the man whose land it concerned had a right to know about it. That is, maybe, the whole moral. Not about clever planning or hidden wealth, about a woman who did her job completely, in a fluorescent lit records room on a Tuesday afternoon, and then made a phone call she wasn't required to make. The land feeds you twice. But someone has to read page 4. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had someone go out of their way to bring you information they weren't required to bring, tell me in the comments. Tell me what it was and what happened. Share this with a farmer, a rancher, anyone who has ever been told by a banker in a blazer that what they've built doesn't count for much. It counts. It feeds you twice. Like this video. Subscribe next time. A Greene County, Wisconsin dairy barn, 34 Guernsey cows, and a co-op buyer who spent 3 years calling them obsolete. The master cheese grader walked in during the dismissal meeting with a signed designation. What she was carrying changed everything. The morning of June 15th arrived with the kind of Comanche County heat that was already present at 7 o'clock, before the sun was fully up. The kind of heat that doesn't build through the day, but simply starts at one temperature and remains there. Hank had been up since 5:15. He had made coffee and checked the cattle from the front step. They were in the south pasture, settled the same as every morning. He had filled the thermos and driven the perimeter in the truck the way he did every month or so, checking the fence line from the cab. Everything was where it was supposed to be. He showered. He put on his good clothes, the dark slacks and the button shirt he kept for county events and attorney meetings and his wife's funeral. He put the brand registry in the truck out of habit, even though he didn't need it. He drove to Lawton. Diane was already in the parking lot when he arrived. She had the certified copy of the amendment in her folder. She had a second document in the folder, a print of the energy company's public record land survey showing the Dutton parcel inside the survey boundary, which established, without revealing the confidential assessment, that there was a known reason to care about what was below the surface. They rode up together in the elevator. Diane said nothing. Hank said nothing. He had said everything he needed to say in 3 conversations with Diane and 1 with his attorney, and now the conversation would happen in the conference room. Gerald's opening statement took 12 minutes. He went through the acceleration timeline, the cure period, the foreclosure filing, the bank's position. He was prepared. He had done this before. He was confident. He spoke the way people speak when they believe the outcome has already been decided and the meeting is a formality. His attorney had the foreclosure documents organized by tab. Hank's attorney, a land and contract specialist from Lawton named Karen Holt, who had reviewed the amendment on June 11th and spent the following 3 days preparing for this morning, listened without expression. Diane waited. When Gerald finished, Diane opened her folder and placed the certified copy of the 1981 deed amendment on the conference table in front of Gerald. "Before you proceed," she said, "I'd like you to read this." Gerald read it. The room went the way rooms go when someone reads something they cannot immediately categorize and the stakes are very high. One attorney leaned in. The other looked at the title company representative. The title company representative looked at the document. Gerald read line 4 a second time. His voice was flat the second time. He set the document down. He turned to his attorney. His attorney had his own copy of the amendment now. Diane had brought 3 and was reading the same passage. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, 98-degree heat on red clay baking in the Comanche County sun. Inside, a room where a 4-page document filed 41 years ago was doing exactly what Raymond Foss had designed it to do. "We'll need to recess," Gerald said. They recessed. The recess lasted 6 hours, during which Gerald's attorneys read the amendment, called their title insurance contact, reviewed the bank's original title search, and confirmed what Diane already knew. The search had been conducted against the 1939 index. The 1981 amendment had been indexed separately and had not been found. The bank had issued the loan, accepted the surface as collateral, and proceeded to foreclosure without knowing that the mineral rights were reserved. They had been trying to foreclose on something they did not own and could not own. When Gerald came back into the room at 4:30 p.m., his voice had found a different register. The careful, measured register of a banker conducting a negotiation rather than a verdict. He said the bank would need additional time to review the title insurance situation. He said the surface foreclosure proceeding would be paused pending review. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the phrase "red dirt scrub" with a sentimental owner. He simply gathered his documents and his attorneys and left the room. Hank drove home. He walked the fence line in the evening heat, the way he always did when he needed to think. He put his hand on a cedar post, one of Elias's originals, 40 years old and still firm, and stood for a while. Below his feet, something his father had reserved without knowing what it was. The land feeds you twice. It had been feeding the family for 60 years in one way. Now it would feed them in another. He went back to the house. He made coffee. He set the brand registry on the kitchen table beside the manila folder that now held the amendment, on top of the spot where Gerald's acceleration letter used to live. He sat at the table for a long time without doing anything. Then he went to bed. He had to check the cattle in the morning.